My headphones were disconnected. Anyways, welcome to the Staff Engineers Path Book Club. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 5, which is all about leading big projects. And just a quick recap of that chapter, it's talking about large, difficult, or complex projects that could potentially take longer than a short time period, possibly multiple months. The kinds of projects that seem overwhelmingly large or deal with complex and cross-team type of problems. So I had the first question here, and so there's a lot of talk about how to choose what to work on and how to kind of advocate for what you'd like to work on. And the author describes using an RFC process, which is request for comment, and also advocating in other ways, but suggested a variety of topics that you should kind of have an idea and understanding of before you really push forward with a project. And I was happy to see that the list kind of contained everything that we do at GitLab when we are preparing for these sort of large projects or proposals in our issues and epics. But I'm curious, like if you're kind of just, you see a problem and you want to advocate for this new project and nobody else is working on it or prioritizing it yet, that's kind of a lot of work for one person to manage or take on just in order to try to talk other people into the idea. So I'm curious, like, how do you find time to work on that, or how do you decide what aspects are important to work on in order to advocate and get things moving?
Yeah, so I think I can try to answer this question. And I used an example. I pasted a link to the CI time decay blueprint about improving efficiency in how we archive and move around CI data. And this particular project took around 18 months from the idea to actually kicking off the work. And it's been a lot of work for these 18 months to actually convince people that it might be important. And I think that basically finding time, it's how to find time for things like that. It's probably, you can find some tips in issue number 2 in the project I linked from the agenda there. I recently created an issue about some questions from the previous chapter about how to decide what we are going to work on. And for me, advocating for doing something that you believe is important is part of the job. So and then of course you need to evaluate the priority and decide whether you want to spend time on this or not. And it's probably a slightly different answer and different scope of the answer than what you asked about. But yeah, I think that I'm usually using this data-informed way, because using solid data is one of the best ways to provide clarity around whether something should be done or not. And getting this data is something that definitely it's important to spend time on. But when you are working on a project like that, it's never just one thing. I mean, you can make some step, get some data, show it to your manager, and ask them, do you think it's okay to spend more time on this, right? And things like that. You are moving forward step by step, and after some time you have really a lot of solid data on this topic, and you use this data to explain the priority, the importance, and eventually someone is going to make a decision to start an effort like that or not. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. So it sounds more like I was envisioning like, okay, I want to do this thing. I'm gonna like spend a bunch of time figuring it out and then kind of like propose it, but it's more that you just chip away at it over time in small pieces, and then it starts to grow. So it's not necessarily like you're dedicating a massive amount of time towards it at the beginning of the process.
Yes, I think it's it's exactly that, and I think it's very important to figure it out, how to start well. What's going to be the first message you are going to convey to people that are decision makers? How to explain, you the idea that you want to spend a bit more time on figuring it out. And yeah.
I guess in addition to convincing others, another aspect is also actually convincing yourself that it's important and worth your time and worth focusing on. I actually really like the idea of kind of using data to, well, it's a double-edged, well, maybe not double-edged sword, but I guess not everything worth doing can easily be measured. If you can find some data that backs up your theories or that sort of shows the problem, great. But I guess it's also not always that easy because you have kind of long-term effects that are measured on the timescale of years and sort of second-order effects or side effects that maybe there's no convenient metric for.
Yes, like dealing with high impact but low frequency events, which we just spent a week dealing with in Redis cluster to cover some very important corner cases that hopefully don't happen, but now will not harm us.
Yeah, when what I'm sometimes doing when there's no data I can actually use is just talking with other experienced engineers, brainstorming together. Sometimes it's enough to convince myself that something is important, but in such cases it's usually very difficult to convince decision makers to actually invest time and money in doing something when it's not really supported by any kind of very concrete evidence.
There was a recording of a conference talk called Quantifying Risk that talks about I guess the difficulties of getting funding for projects similar to what Matt described that are infrequent, maybe unlikely, or there's a low likeliness, but you still want to sort of protect against it. And I guess I kind of have a bias towards that being in infra. I guess infra and security tend to be more directly exposed to these types of events. But I thought that was a really good presentation that effectively suggests attaching a dollar value and a probability to these events and then multiplying that out. And it's sort of, it's a little hand wavy, right? But it gives you at least a way of talking about and comparing the worth or the cost benefit of various potentially large projects. I'll be honest, I'm super behind on reading. I'm like two chapters behind, so I just kind of tried to skim most of the latest chapter.
The summary at the end of the chapter is good.
Yeah.
That can happen. Cool. Ben, looks like you've got the next point here.
Yeah, so I skimmed most of chapter 3, paid some attention to chapter 4, and I've been plowing through chapter 5. And my overwhelming impression is these chapters kind of serve to reinforce a point that the author made earlier in the book. Whenever there's a feeling of someone should do something here, there's a reasonable chance that someone is you. Yeah, so chapter 5 just seems to kind of cover every potential role that a big project could have, and then explain to you how you should do it. And I'm kind of struggling to get through it really. Where I do see the value is if I was in a situation where I've identified no one's doing that particular role, being able to refer to this and have the benefit of their wisdom, I can see being useful. But coming to it dry, I'm finding it to be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I'll definitely say that I always read the chapter the right night before, like right before I go to bed for this book club, because this is my morning right now. And like I don't sleep very well after I read these chapters because I'm always like, wow, okay, this is like there's a lot on my plate here. Like if this is supposed to be a description of what I'm supposed to be doing, like it's just quite a lot. And I really enjoy the descriptions that she gives. Like I think it's a very helpful guide, but kind of to agree with Ben's point, like there's a lot there, right? It's like you like do the product management. What are your metrics for success? Write a compelling narrative that anybody can understand, even if they're not familiar with the problem. It's I can't help but feel that I'm deficient in many ways, just given the sheer number of responsibilities described in this chapter and the other chapters. So Hercules, you have your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one small detail I read in the chapter about a mistake, and it really resonated with me because I made this mistake before. In one part of the book, it says that don't specify in details the technologies used when you're writing a design document. And I have made this mistake before, and because I knew my strengths and my skills, and also I knew the team that I would be working on, and I knew well the problem, and then I specified all the programming languages, frameworks, and how they would be used. And when I came to the other teams to present the idea, I wanted them to challenge my idea in the design document, and the technologies were just a small detail. They could be any other programming language or framework, because the problem at hand was not something super difficult to solve. But then people started discussing why using these technologies instead of focusing on the problem and how to solve the problem. And yeah, we wasted a lot of time just because of that. If I have left out this detail, people would discuss about the problem at hand and how they wanted to solve, instead of just discussing why using a specific technology.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I think part of choosing the story you want to tell, particularly when you're selling an idea, is choosing the points of focus that you want readers and reviewers to focus on. I spend a lot of time differentiating between what is the problem that we want to solve versus how are we going to solve it. And I find it really useful, depending on the context and the people that you're working with, and the relationships that you have. Separating those two out can be really useful. So I guess sometimes, what I'm saying is, I feel like it's always helpful to describe the problem in an easily understandable way apart from the implementation, and sometimes it's also useful as an addendum to include a concrete example of pieces of the solution as kind of an optional for reference, not as a mandatory requirement. Sometimes concrete examples help kind of drive the conversation forward, I guess is all I'm really adding.
Yeah, I think that overall idea definitely stands out to me as well. There was another section in that chapter that kind of said the same thing that stood out to me, which was when you're delivering status updates, you might be inclined to share like all of the information that you have because more information is better. But that's not necessarily true because too much details obscure your message. And I think I've run into that a lot with status updates, and with just because we are async, it's kind of like, I might not hear back from this person until tomorrow, so I should give as much information as possible. But then when I do hear back, they missed the main thing and went with the second part. So It's a really good point.
Oh, I totally agree. I don't know if this is helpful to anyone else, but I compulsively need to give like, detailed messages. So I'll always write that out in detail and then go back to the very top of the thing and try to summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences. And that way people can ignore everything else I wrote if they're not interested in more than the gist.
Yeah, if you go to our index page for all the architecture evolution blueprints, you will see that almost everyone has an executive summary at the beginning. And a couple of times I got explicitly asked to add executive summary because someone didn't really want to read through all of it. So.
One of the things I actually felt a bit like Jesse, where I was like, what are you supposed to be doing all of these things? Like, no, there's no way. You're a single person, you only have so much time in your day. And that's assuming that you don't get pulled into incidents and escalations, which I'm sure pretty much all of us do. I want to actually like go back to a little, like, kind of much earlier in the book where the author talks about how they had written this while focused on staff engineer, actually to be able to apply to a lot of different roles, and also recognizing that staff plus can mean so many different things and cover a very different set of responsibilities depending on the organization and the organizational needs. So I do kind of want to, almost reiterate the fact that I don't think anyone expects any of us to like do all of these things. And while I found the exercises useful to think about, I honestly didn't actually work through any of them on paper or anything. Part of it was time, but part of it was just I don't know that it's the right time for me to be going through some of those exercises. I feel like some of them will the opportunity is kind of past, or it's something that I need to look at later, like potentially, but I don't know that it's useful for me right now. And I mentioned before, in support in particular, we have a very, very broad scope of responsibilities. I mean, look at how big the product is. I'm sure that's true though, even in like, and while the scope I think is a little bit different for someone in development most of the time, I'm sure it's true in infra too. I mean, infra covers so much, right? And same with security. It's like no staff that we've had has been focused on the same thing. And I think it's important to have a good understanding of what your focus and scope should be whenever you're staff plus, or even working towards a staff plus promotion. So that's kind of my take on it. I do want to emphasize that, especially GitLab is such a large product. Most of the time, there's no way you're going to be able to know and do everything.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Today I had this conversation with someone about the staff plus engineer archetypes that we have documented in our handbook. And someone asked me, like, how can you do all those things? Or am I supposed to do one of those things? And for me, it's more like being willing to do all of those things, but perhaps specializing in one or two. But when there is a business need, you can actually transition between different archetypes. But it's never like you are the best in all of this. But sometimes it's just what you prefer to do, and I think in the end it's just about having a positive impact on the company, on people around you. And yeah, I'm not sure if this answers your question, or yeah, but wanted to share. But the archetypes may be confusing a bit.
Yeah, I will add that I think it's really important to give yourself the latitude to take off a hat when you're putting on a different hat. And it's also really valuable because everyone's going to have their own, interests and aptitudes. And I think respecting that in your own work is really important. It's okay to give yourself latitude to focus on areas that you find rewarding and gratifying, as long as you're able to put on the other hats as needed.
Yeah, just a side note regarding the archetypes. I believe it's a thing of well, maybe opportunity and what you are aiming for your career, because you can be the expert and then you will have your mind already set to be the expert in a certain technology or a certain area of the business, and then when the time comes, then you are able to mix like your expertise with the opportunity. And sometimes people have more people-related activities like managing teams or cross-team collaboration, and they are both like staff plus engineer tasks, but they have completely different skill sets. Let's say some people are driven in a certain path, other people they intentionally try to aim for that specific archetype. So I don't think there is a right or wrong decision here. Maybe it's more a thing of do we have opportunity to do this in a certain way and use our skill set, or are we driven away from what we are aiming and because we need to do a different kind of task?
I think it's interesting, like on the subject of big projects, like if we look at each archetype, like what role they play in a big project, and it's like they can all play similar roles, but coming from different angles depending on their styles and expertises, which I think that adds to the just overall, I guess, variety of ways that things can get done.
I want to ask people's takes on how do you feel about big projects in general? And I'm going to define a big project as, I guess, project that takes, let's say, longer than a quarter.
I will say my experience with big projects here, I find it can be difficult to see them come to like completion for me. That's what I've seen, because I've had quite a few times where like organizational priorities get shifted and all of a sudden, oh no, we don't go back and touch that. And it's hard to get back to those things. And I don't know. Yeah, it's just something I've observed. I haven't found any really good way to like adjust it, but there's like just code. I know I put code out in the code base that's just kind of like half done, maybe not finished, for a feature that doesn't exist yet, but still they want it at some point.
I guess that's the risk of iteration, that you can get pulled into other things, and like you said, you leave half-done things behind.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Right now I'm involved in a couple of big projects, and in the past I definitely experienced this problem of sudden change in priorities and moving on to different things. So the way I'm trying to mitigate this problem is not only dividing large projects into iterations, but first dividing them into phases, and only phases are divided into iterations. The narrative around that is that you should not really interrupt the project within a phase. You can interrupt the project between phases, but a phase should be done as a whole. But phases are small enough to actually convince people that let's finish this phase. And this is especially important when you think about technical debt that may be left in the code base when phase is not complete and stuff like that. So helping PMs and EMs to plan the work in a way that there are phases and iterations, it's really helpful to avoid this problem of leaving a lot of technical debt when there is a suddenly change in priorities.
I also think that in terms of the original question about how do you feel about big projects, I remember this actually came up I'll find the recording after this. It was some all hands, like SID AMER or something, and somebody was asking about our organizational structure and kind of like the pods. Like we have these groups of people from different department, front end, back end, technical writer, and we're in these little pods, which is really great for pushing forward initiatives that are specific to that group really quickly because it's very efficient for that group, but it makes cross-organizational projects more difficult. And there are other ways to organize a company and they all have pros and cons. But I think for me, looking at work on a large project that's going to require cross-organizational support, I definitely am asking myself the question, how do I get these people motivated to even help with this large project? Because it helps them, but it's really a project that comes out of my group. And I think that's kind of the most intimidating thing, not so much the length of the project, but the span or the scope of people who need to be involved.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I was thinking more about duration and scope, or I guess how many stakeholders there are potentially is another axis by which you can evaluate the size and scope of a project.
Yeah, I feel like I think I share Jesse's perspective. It's the larger number of people you have to bring into a project, the harder it is for me personally to kind of metabolize the anxiety and stress of selling the idea to each group that needs to be part of it. Once we have some momentum, though, once we've got people invested in solving it, I love working on projects where we can build up the momentum, and particularly if we've got solid breakpoints between to deliver results iteratively. I think to your point of a project spanning multiple quarters, I totally agree. It's important to have. I love the framing of having phases where you can stop after completing a phase, and you have something deliverable. You've got clean stopping points, and people can kind of reconvene after the phase.
I wanted to, since we're about at time, I wanted to also give my perspective on the question I asked. I hate big projects. I hate them. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think that the last point is mine. I wanted to share this project I created some time ago to make it easier for people to ask questions, and perhaps there are questions that are not being answered in the book, and perhaps we have Staff Plus, Principal Plus engineers who can answer them. And my commitment here is that I will try to find answers for you if you have them. I may not be able to do that, but I can at least try. So if you have any question, you would like to ask, you can do that in on Slack in a private message, or you can create an issue in that project. And I hope that it's going to be helpful.
Thanks. Ben, did you want to verbalize your last point there about the last discussion?
Yeah. I've been involved in large projects, but generally speaking, I've been an individual contributor. But in terms of being responsible in any way for a project, yeah, I can't conceive of all of my roles. Fundamentally, have been torn between so many different things, usually kind of operational responsibilities and mentoring people and just diving into whatever was on fire. But there was a couple of roles back, I was running backup infrastructure, and fundamentally we needed to rebuild all the server infrastructure from scratch and most of the fiber channel infrastructure as well. And I'd been planning for it for years. I had servers racked up, and I've been begging, borrowing, stealing everything I needed to do the work. And then I resigned, and I delivered it in my notice period. And that was the only way I could get the focus, because management were then like, shit, we've got to get this done now. And so, yeah, basically I wasn't allowed to do anything else. So, but yeah, I'm proud of that.
All right, well, I think that's a good point to stop it since we're a little bit over time here, but thanks everyone for joining in, and yeah, I look forward to talking about chapter 6 next week.